Thank you, everybody, for coming. We're glad you're here, and we've kind of we had a few ideas for this session, but realistically, what we're going to do is have it kind of be a roundtable, an open discussion on what our vision, Veeam's vision is for AI, how you can use it, how we envision our customers using it, and then talking with Microsoft as well on all the myriad of solutions that you can use within Microsoft when it comes to AI. Ways you can secure it, ways that they secure your data, things like that. So also, I feel like we'll leave some time for questions. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and ask them, and we're happy to help. So I guess we'll do a brief of introductions to say who we are. My name is Dustin Albertson. I am the Director of Product Management for Cloud and Applications at Veeam. I've been with Veeam almost 10 years now. And Dave?
Dave Russell, Senior Vice President, Head of Strategy. Been at Veeam 6 years, been following Veeam when I was a Gartner analyst, actually 3 weeks before version 1 of the product.
Awesome. Sure. I'm Ashan. I manage the technical relationship between Microsoft and Veeam, and I'll pass along to Jeremiah.
Yeah, I'm Jeremiah Tucker. I'm the CTO for the Microsoft ISV and Digital Natives business, and been at Microsoft 23.5 years and in the industry for about 37 years.
Nice, nice. You got me beat. I'm 35 years. I look older than you. What's up with that? It's the hat, yeah.
So on the main stage this morning, we demoed a few AI products, but the one that I was most recently involved in is the AI product Topaz, we call it, for 365. I guess we could start there. So, Dave, would you give a little bit of your vision on how you envision Veeam using AI moving forward, as well as in your role, you tend to go out and speak with a lot of customers and partners, and I'd be interested in what kind of feedback you get from them on AI, because it seems like AI is just the buzzword that everybody's using now to try to cram into something, right? So.
Yeah, in fact, we were literally just talking about this before we turned the mic on up here on stage. So there's a number of interesting things that we think that we can do. AI, like your point, Dustin, it's like cloud. What is that? It's an overloaded concept. And so when we think about AI, it will be a progression. First and foremost, we're really committed to trying to make a better user experience, meaning initially the user is the administrator of our product set. We think that has a number of benefits, whether that's cost optimization, making sure you're utilizing resources effectively. Of course, you can't have too much of a conversation without mentioning something like cyber threats. So an issue of making sure that you're secure. Are your users protected? Is the configuration of your infrastructure or the backup repository properly protected? So one of the ways now, maybe I'll try to keep it brief, Dustin, is so today we have a chat experience, and actually in version 12.1 that shipped at the end of last year, we offered a Veeam AI assistant where you could have a natural language type of experience with Veeam to ask a question. But we were just talking, literally 2-3 minutes ago.
Yeah, exactly.
And saying, hey, well, if Veeam today, let's say that you're the administrator of Microsoft 365, going through the Veeam console, could you ask, show me all my unprotected users? Okay, here's the list. Show me from a legal perspective how long I should be protecting these. Maybe you get now additional information. Ultimately, you could get to the point where you could get asked, would you like me, and in this case, the me is the product itself, to go in and actualize that change on your behalf? So the idea would be, can we take best practices and be able to offer that in a digestible way, but also then take the next leap, which is, if appropriate, of course, and with proper oversight, to go and actually instantiate that update.
I agree. When we first started looking at I call it Topaz, but when we first started looking at AI, a couple of guys from my team, Johan's actually in here as well, we all sat down and we said, we had these ideation sessions, right? And there's so much that you can do, it gets too much. And we had to take a step back and say, okay, let's narrow it down to 3 or 4 things. And what's most important on the daily life of an admin that would make his life easier. And let's focus on those and start there. And then what we value most at Veeam is feedback, right? From our forums, from customers, however we can get it, is saying, what do you want? What can make your life easier? And to add on to what you're saying, a big one in my mind is compliance and data security and privacy, like GDPR, all those kind of things that are hard to do. Leveraging AI to be able to put those frameworks on top of the existing data sets that you have and say, hey, we're noticing that this backup contains PII data, or this backup contains a user's data that was supposed to be deleted from GDPR. Would you like me to delete that, or would you like me to remove? All of those kind of things to, make it more efficient in your day-to-day management, because usually your backup administrator is not your most seasoned IT person. It's usually the first person in, and everybody shoves that off onto them, right? It's not fun. So being able to make those a little bit easier, and is that kind of what you're seeing as well, or you and I have talked a lot about AI recently, and there's a ton of things you can do, but how would you start out if somebody said, what should I do with AI, or what can I do?
I think it comes down to finding like a very clear use case, and so the ideation sessions are really important because you can build all kinds of products, but it's important that the AI serves the core purpose of the product. And so when I think about what like Veeam is focused on, and ease of use is one of the most important things, then a service like a chatbot or a copilot makes it a lot easier for an end customer or an IT admin who's maybe new to that role, new to that data, and needs to figure out how to manage and work with their enterprise. And they're trying to figure out how to be compliant. And compliance is never a one-person question. It's something that Jeremiah and I were discussing. It's something that requires the whole organization to be involved. And so if you have access to the enterprise data, you have access to the enterprise policies, and maybe you don't know what they are or where they're at, but if you have a service that brings it all together, then you can have kind of a system integration of all these key concepts layered on top with AI, and it's a tremendous value.
So you mentioned, I'm sorry, go ahead.
If I may add just a couple of things, right? Because based on what you said and we discussed, what we discussed, at Microsoft, as the CTO for the ISV, for the software partners, right, I get asked a lot, Jeremiah, on the one hand, we had to kind of focus on getting all the fundamentals right? Security, we just talked about. In this day and age, it's, for ransomware attacks, it's not about if and when, it's how often. So there are certain non-negotiables, what we call as engineering fundamentals. You got to nail them. But then there's also the need for innovation. And the innovation, just like you said, is based on the persona and what is the lived experience of that persona. Are we really making a tangible difference in the lived experience of that individual, the admin or other personas that are involved here? So at Microsoft, I just wanted to quickly say that I get that from across the breadth of the partners that we actually have a framework for this. So first is what we call as a BXT, because when we're trying to build out these scenarios that you talked about and the ideation session, you need some sort of a framework that is not just looking at it from the tech perspective, but also from what we call as the BXT framework, right? The business, what are some of the business drivers? What are some of the business criteria? The X is the experience, that's in the center, and then T for technology. So we have this very well-defined framework that we use for having that innovation discussion with most of our strategic partners and customers. Now beyond that, as you rightfully said, and you mentioned earlier as well, it's not just about AI, it's not just about data, it's not just about security, it's all of that. So we have a very well-defined framework that is called Cloud Solution Journey Map, and that essentially looks at all the different pillars of security, infra, app innovation, right? The business applications and AI itself, and the edge. And that framework essentially helps you decide, first of all, baseline where you are, and then you make very conscious decisions that I want to move up the dial on security, I moved up the dial on AI, and before that, have you gotten the data in broad? So that framework really helps us to have, I think, more of a structured and consistent way to do the kind of things that we're talking about.
I was actually going to ask something like that. As a customer, comes in, there's lots of different things. Like you mentioned Copilot, right? There's multiple Copilots.
Exactly.
There's Azure OpenAI, there's Azure AI, where would somebody start if they're trying to learn about some of these, items, or what would be the best place to go, or, things like that, so.
And so you can go as deep as you want. Like the concepts, a lot of them are not like brand new. The origins of generative AI come from machine learning, and so that's been tried and tested for the last 30 years. And then since then, models have evolved, and we start to see new capabilities emerge from them. The fundamentals of neural networks and vectors and transformer architecture is still the same, but now we have a lot more of the resources to make those things become accessible to the public. And that's where Microsoft has made a huge investment in them. And part of that investment is also the education of how these services work. And so I would recommend to anyone to visit documentation as a good starting point, but also for customers that are regularly using Microsoft products, there are particular resources that you're probably already engaged with. I would ask for more questions around that. But I think one question that probably comes to mind is, if you're backing up all your data and you're trusting this AI service to manage it, why would you trust the Microsoft platform, or any platform for that matter? Because as we move into the next phase of this AI experience, we're going to see even more autonomous systems making decisions for us. And I think there's a certain set of trust that you put in these systems, and there's outcomes that have real-world impact. And so I was wondering, if I think maybe we could take like a quick second to talk about some of these ethical principles that are baked into some of our AI products, which is why companies like Veeam can trust it, and it's why customers can trust their data to be in this service. And so I think something that's important to know, and it's not just a Microsoft thing, but it's an industry-wide thing, is that there are really 6 principles around responsible AI. And when we build AI systems, and when you build AI systems, that's a really important part to start off with. And the important thing is to think of it that there is no additional biases in that system that would mean that certain users would be targeted maybe unfairly, or that their data would be picked up in a way that would put them in a situation that otherwise wouldn't exist. So that's a principle that we believe is really important. There's also a sense of reliability. So when you use the system, it has to repeatedly work. And if it doesn't work, you should be able to say what you would attribute that to. And so there's also a little bit of responsibility for the AI system as well that you want to see, and that we want to see. And the other thing I think that is important is that it's inclusive, and so that these products that we're talking about and that we're building and that we hope that more users will use is available and easily accessible to folks. And so as part of our design of our technology and systems, that's something that you should notice as a differentiator as part of the Microsoft platform.
You bring up a good point. I mean, is for somebody who wouldn't be familiar with AI, right? You hear a lot of hype, you hear a lot of stuff about it, but then when you think about it in correlation to backup, you're like, that's my data, right? That's the lifeblood of my company. That's where all of our proprietary information is, personal information, things like that. Can you hit on maybe the high level of what does Azure do as far as security about that, and how is it maybe segmented, or what, how can I be sure that my data is safe?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say when you're thinking about data security, the first thing that comes to mind is this AI model being trained on the data that I'm putting into it or backing up into it? And the answer to that is Microsoft does not in any way train on the customer data at all to improve the models itself. And so that is something that we stand by on, and that's something that has been tried and true from the very inception of this product release, and it's something that you'll see across all of our products. So that's, I think, the most important thing. The second thing is that like we talked about, data attacks they end up at the target data source, which is the data backup, but they don't begin there. In fact, there's several layers of data protection that our platform offers to ensure that the data that you have stored on the platform is secure. And so that can include networking controls, security controls, application controls, infrastructure controls, and all of those things are tightly controlled. And so on top of the AI controls, you have these. And if those controls, if there's any gaps in those controls, then you have the AI controls to fall back on. But like we say, that's like our last line of defense. Once you get into the AI model itself, you have a bunch of other controls that are already in place. And if you're curious about those AI controls, that's something we could also talk about in more depth as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would like to add that, fundamentally, if you go back to 2002, when Bill Gates wrote that memo, and we had the Trustworthy Computing Initiative. So behind the scenes, even though people always say security is the enemy of usability, but behind the scenes, all of our engineering teams have been kind of adhering to that trustworthy computing principles ever since. But recently, even outside of AI, because as you rightly said, right, AI is just one part of this. There's a whole other set of Microsoft clouds that come together to deliver that experience that we talked about. So Satya, our CEO, stood up at one of our internal leadership meetings, and he said, security is number one. There should be no confusion about this. This is the number one priority. And you see all the momentum with Microsoft and AI, and for the CEO to stand up and say, yes, we will go and we will continue to invest and we'll continue to be in the leadership. But security is the number one priority. There should be no doubt about that fact. I think that says a lot about the commitment from the very top and across the breadth of our Microsoft clouds in terms of why security is so critical. So much so that our current DT semester, so we name our semesters 6-month semesters, there's a 90-day sprint that every engineering team has to do that is focused solely on security. So that's how inherent it is in our DNA to build that ground up, all the way up to the AI layers and the things that Ashen talked about.
And I think that's important to highlight, right, is a lot of times we get lost in the capabilities, but not the security behind it and all the...
And the culture of security, right? You have to
Yeah.
embrace that, because every time you're making that investment, there is some cool wow feature that's missing.
Yeah. Well,
And you have to make a tough choice, and that's why I really appreciate Satya's very clear focus. There should be no doubt that if you have to make a choice, it's security.
And I would say, like, as part of the organization that our team is in, which is software and digital platforms, Veeam is probably one of the front-leading companies using AI in the backup space, which is a huge differentiator. And as we continue on in this year, it's going to lead to some pretty incredible leaps and bounds as we expect in this space. But I would also say that you can take like our words for security, but I think another probably a really clear, tangible example is that in that space, we also work very closely with security companies, some of the companies that you've probably used as well. And those companies are leveraging our technology to build some of their core products. And for them to trust us, and for a security company to trust us requires a lot of conversations around the minute details that are incredibly important in making these products work. And so, although we're having a general discussion, the point being that, like, depending on whatever your level of comfort is with our technologies, Microsoft is willing to meet you there. And I think that's really important for users.
I think that's a big point to hit on as well, is when you're working with security vendors, the zero trust, right?
Yes.
So they trust but verify, right? So I'm
Mostly
sure
verify.
I'm sure they've come in and they said, okay, we've had this discussion, but show me, right? Let me see the back end. Let me see how it's segmented.
Yep.
All of that, so that they can feel safe and that it is secure when they're partnering together with you. That's really big, right?
Yeah, like I would say, the fact that we don't train on customer data is like massive when you work with any company that has their own protected IP. The second thing is, like, they'll have their own customer data that they're responsible for, so they want to make sure that you're not breaking any rules that they're in compliance with. So those things are like, we start there usually in those kinds of conversations. And then it's like, okay, well, what is the real benefit we're going to get out of using this service? And so then a lot of times we saw a really great example of, I think, a generative AI use case in today's demo, but there are other patterns that we have noticed that you can use generative AI for that aren't always like consumer facing. There's sometimes like a middleware component that does a really important task, and you can allow a large language model to do that task instead of using a lot of these really specific machine learning models and then training on it. And the nice thing is that with like concepts like RAG, retrieval augmented generation, you're able to actually come up with really, really clear chunks of data that you express to the model are really, really important. And then it trains on that. And so you can work on accuracy just like you would any other machine learning model. And so I think that's an important part, I think, that we have kind of also discussed when we were working with some of the backup data, because we wanted to ensure that we continue to move towards a place where like a backup admin is getting the types of answers that they're expecting.
And Dave, I mean, for me, the fact that they don't train on customer data is big, right? Because that's the easy thing to do, right? And it's not the right thing to do, but that's a lot of value sitting in that data when it comes to like AI training, right?
Yeah, hugely.
Yeah.
And, I like to say we're like the librarians, right? We don't own the books, we're caretakers of the books. It's not our job to inspect the data. Our job is just to make sure whatever it is we've ingested, we're preserving it well, we've made a good copy of. But at the end of the day, we're no value judgment, but also no leakage, right? Increasingly, we're going to be in a world where the data that comes into us is going to be encrypted right from the beginning. You could argue maybe there's a future of could you selectively decrypt that to go and do interesting things on that data payload? But ultimately, we should just think about good computer science principles, or at least storage management principles. If we go back to the late 80s, it was abstract, pool, and automate. And VMware tried to kind of act like that was something that they invented about 30 years later. But the concept has always been there. How can you virtualize different resources, compute, networking, storage, et cetera? Pool that together, and we're doing that, for example, with our Microsoft 365 protection engine. You heard Anton describe pooling our proxy or our data movement components. The next level of automation is then extending what we could do with AI to shorten the time frame and improve the accuracy of the best practice recommendation that can be given. So I tried to purposely reduce it to something that didn't sound new whatsoever, because the idea here isn't necessarily to say what is going to be achievable is radically different than what you could do before. What's radically different is the time frame and the accuracy. So it's not a matter of go replace the ineffective human necessarily, it's go ease the burden of having to have the most effective human.
I agree, and if I'm being honest, I'm like a chatbot kind of pessimist, right? Just by nature, the last thing I want to do now is chat with something else. I have enough Teams messages throughout the day when it comes to work that I don't want to chat with anything else. But in reality, I do see the value. When we talk about co-pilots, at first I was like, it's like yet another thing to chat with, but it really depends on your job function, and one of the things that you're doing is kind of creating co-pilots where they can be plugged in by third parties, right? And if I look at one that's it's not a company affiliated with us, but like Salesforce, right? We use Salesforce internally. A lot of companies use Salesforce, and from a sales process, someone to go into Teams and say, what's the status of this opportunity, or where do we sit with this, and have it go do this kind of day-to-day or routine tasks that other people would have to do, and it takes hours to do. There's a lot of power in that, right? Being able to shorten sales cycles, being able to more, and then look at support, right? Being able to have effective support, knock off a lot of these tier one kind of easy entry-level questions by providing that kind of best practice or configuration advice from within the chat of the product, right? So I do see a lot of value there. And can you talk about that ecosystem or the the plans that you guys have for that?
Yeah, I think one thing that if folks that are familiar with copilots have noticed with other competitors, and we can use Salesforce, that's totally fine, is that a lot of times the copilots sit within the actual product solution itself. So like with Salesforce, you have like Einstein GPT that does a great job of looking at your CRM data, and then what it'll do is you can converse with it and make updates on records or retrieve records and do a lot of the tasks without actually having to leave the conversation interface. It's fantastic. Now, there are also other customers that will use products outside of Salesforce, right? And so the integration capabilities become even more important. Something that Microsoft has focused on is bringing the Copilot to you so that you can pull in whatever data sources you need to, and then you're able to now do the Copilot across your stack. And I would say that that's a pretty clear differentiation, because what it does is it also changes the way that a lot of people work.
So like as a partner, right, for us, it means it's easier to plug into, right? Like we don't have to create this whole chat back end or this
Yeah, if you're
whole
building a
framework,
product,
right? Yeah,
totally, yeah.
That, you have a set of APIs, you have a set of requirements that we can then create a plugin that interacts in with that Copilot to then, make it easier, faster to go to market with whatever solution we're trying to provide, right?
Yeah. And if I may, the other thing, the way I look at the Copilot, and first of all, there are different manifestations of Copilot for the different products, right? M365 security. But Microsoft also has what we call as a Copilot stack that anybody can use to build a Copilot. And our own teams use that. So it's not like, willy-nilly, just everybody's creating their own version of a Copilot, because then things get out of control. There's governance, et cetera, required around that. And the way I look at Copilot, and including that stack, is it's essentially your socket. So just like you have a desktop or you have a mobile phone, right? The Copilot is your socket. If you had a mobile phone and it didn't have different apps, it would kind of be, not really much value.
Yeah.
So I think the bigger thinking around Copilot is that Copilot is your socket and your entry point into all the enterprise systems that are there. Because whether anybody likes it or not, all these systems are in our enterprises. SAP is there, Adobe is there, right? Salesforce is there, Workday is there, Microsoft is there, Veeam is there. So when you have these systems, Copilot is enabling you for the first time without having to go through like massive pro dev efforts to create custom UXs, to use natural language and the power of all these different systems to come together to the end user, right? So that's how I view Copilot, is it's your socket.
Yeah.
And by itself, it's like my mobile phone, my desktop. But once I start integrating all these different systems, including Veeam, SAP, NetApp, like whatever else, all of a sudden, I have all the key apps that help me get to a level of productivity that was honestly unimaginable before.
Yeah. I think, a lot of it is kind of the Wild West right now with AI. Everybody's trying to put a stamp on everything, but I think there's going to be, what we'll see is that noise will kind of die down a little bit, and then we'll see real value coming out of it, because right now it's kind of the art of the possible, but then we'll see the possible actually happen, right? And then all of these use cases that we haven't thought about or that people are working on right now will come out, and we'll say, okay, that's super useful, right? That's handy. That makes my daily life much more efficient. So I think we'll see a lot of that come out. But
yeah, though I will say, just real quick, right? Yes, there is art of possible for something like this, but remember, this has been around for a while, and we have been working on it. So I myself honestly cannot live without Copilot literally multiple times every day, because there are certain things, including, let's say, preparing for this session, where Copilot was kind of a de facto, right? It's a non-negotiable for me. So I'm just saying that, yes, there are emerging and it's the Wild West, but there are very concrete things that you can do right now with Copilot that just makes your day and your experience so much better.
Yeah, we have it in our teams. We have it in meetings, and being able to get a summary, being able to do all that, and I'll get long emails, and I have Copilot that's like, you summarize this for me, right? And it chunk it down.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it's great. Sometimes I don't want to have to read the War and Peace email that I just got to get the chunk of valuable information that I need. But we are running up on time, but I wanted to save a couple of minutes maybe for questions, if anybody has any questions on AI from Veeam's point of view, or AI from Microsoft. So if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll try to get them answered. Yeah.
So at the beginning, you mentioned something about when you're using the Veeam chatbots. There was a question about, you could put a question of like, am I compliant?
Mm-hmm.
That would sort of imply that you have access, relatively frequently updated access to compliance data, but that also has to be applied to the company itself, because not every company has to be compliant to the same regulations. So is that in fact something that is intended for the ChatGPT Veeam component to be able to, for a company to say what they need to be compliant to?
So I would say the long-term vision, yes. But what we're looking at right now, or we're looking at using.
Well, I think they want the audience wanted to repeat.
Question.
Okay, he's asking if in the chat bot portion, being able to look at compliance. He's saying, is that looking at data? Is that kind of the vision that we have for it, being able to interact with that data, and that data could be spread across multiple zones and regions and areas, things like that. What I was replying is that that's the vision, but what we're looking at in the short to medium term is ways that we can interact with services, APIs at Microsoft or Azure that don't require us to actually peer into that data. What I mean by that, there's other services like Purview. There's a whole plethora of security services and Sentinel and things like that Azure offers. That if a customer's using that, we can leverage those APIs to make this backup process a little easier, right? Now, they may be using multiple products, but what we're trying to focus on is saying, okay, we can bring in what's pertinent from those products into that backup administrator's visibility. And this is where he can make those decisions and say, okay, I have a risk officer saying, do we have any PII information spread across, we have hundreds of accounts, right? Being able to do that from his console without having to have access into all these other services that he may not have access to is kind of like the vision that we're looking at that for. So long story short, we're trying to figure out ways that we can do it without actually having to peer into that data. But I would say if we do have to peer into that data, we would probably do it in a way that would require the customer, being okay with that, and then we'd fully be open with any kind of reading of that data or any kind of interaction with that data at all. But our core would be to stay out of the data, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to peer into your data. We want to protect your data and make sure that you have full access to it.
Yeah, the analogy I would use is our recovery orchestration tool today can talk about service level attainment or a miss. And how it's doing that is it's comparing against the policy of recovery point and recovery time objectives, and it's using that to say, do you have adherence or a mismatch between your service level? So even without branching outside of what Veeam knows at a metadata level, we could say, are you compliant with your chosen rules for this data, either in terms of retention or accessibility or number of copies or some other attribute associated with that? Then you could layer on top of that additional ecosystem of compliance, adherence to be able to say to other systems, are you able to achieve that or not? I just came from Europe last week where things like DORA and NIS2 are hugely a discussion point. And so sovereignty is one of the main ones that's sort of etched in my mind right now after hearing so many over there speak about that. Where today we have in the product, hey, we understand there's a geographical difference between where you backed up the data and where this restore request is coming from. We can surface that dialog box already today. We could do something very similarly to have a chatbot say, give me a list of every scenario where I shouldn't be able to restore. Mm-hmm. Maybe I want to know about that because that's actually a mistake. Right? It wasn't that someone was going to do something malicious. It's that no one ever took into account that there's now going to be this difference in where it was backed up and where it's eligible to be restored to. So long-winded way of saying that notion of compliance, I think, is very broad, but we can start to do, as Dustin suggested, more advice on that. In some cases, it's maybe even education on that without having to inspect actual customer data.
Any other questions? Good. Everybody's ready to use AI, right? But so we're running up on the end of the session, so I just wanted to again say thank you,
yes.
Ashton, thank you, Jeremiah, thank you, Dave. We truly do value the partnership. We've spent a lot of time together recently, and more to come, right? So
yes.
we truly do value it, and sometimes I'm overloaded with all the options, but you do a good job at kind of grounding it and explaining, this may be more of a fit, this may make more sense. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you
for having us.
the
Thank you, guys.
opportunity.
Yeah.
Partnership.
Thank you.